Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome and thank each and every one of you for participating in CTAC's Patient Input Consultation webinar for Prezcobix, which is Janssen's new fixed-dose combination product to treat HIV infection. My name is Barbara Santos-Woso, and I'm one of the policy researchers here at CTAC. Now, before we begin, I would just like to ask anyone who has already not done so to please mute their line by pressing *6 on their phone, and this is to avoid any interference during the first portion of the webinar. So before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Canadian Treatment Action Council, otherwise known as CTAC. And for those of you who are not already familiar with our work, CTAC is Canada's national civil society organization, and we address access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and hepatitis C. At CTAC, we meaningfully engage with a broad number of stakeholders, ranging from people living with HIV and hepatitis C to frontline service providers, healthcare professionals, and policymakers. We work in collaboration to identify, develop, and implement policy and program solutions. With years of experience under our belt, we successfully bring together a cross-section of diversity and geography among the vast number of stakeholders we reach in order to find solutions. So now, how do we work with these groups of stakeholders? Well, at CTAC, we develop a consultation to action framework to ensure that we meaningfully engage with populations living with HIV and hepatitis C, and this is to ensure that our work is driven by and reflective of the various lived experience of treatment access issues across Canada. We consult with our stakeholders and partners on the barriers that impede access to treatment care and support. We find solutions on improving the cascade of care, and we act collectively to affect positive social change in Canada, and we do this by developing resources to increase the capacity of people living with HIV and Hep C, as well as relevant organizations to address treatment access issues. Our agenda for today is as follows. I'll first begin with providing a very brief overview of the Common Drug Review and provide a review on market access to treatments in Canada, followed by an introduction to Prezcobix, go into some of the key findings from the Prezcobix clinical trial, and after that, I will explain how you could have your voice heard as a person living with HIV or a caregiver, and everyone will also have the opportunity to engage in discussion and ask any questions that may arise. I'll first begin by providing an overview of market access and the CDR process, and I really just want to review this process to ensure that everyone's aware of how drugs actually get approved onto the Canadian market. So in Canada, drug approval happens in 3 ways. The first step is at the regulatory approval at Health Canada. And this is where Health Canada reviews new drug submission data, and they do this to determine a drug's safety and efficacy. And at this stage, if results are deemed favorable and the drug does treat the condition that it's intended to treat, a drug is then issued a notice of compliance, giving manufacturers the approval for the sale of the drug in Canada. The second step of the drug approval process is that all provinces, with the exception of Quebec, who uses its own assessment system, participate in the Common Drug Review. So the Common Drug Review is a part of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, which is otherwise known as CADTH, and it's a pan-Canadian process for conducting objective and rigorous reviews of the clinical, cost-effectiveness, and patient evidence for drugs. And because most people access their HIV medications through publicly available assistance programs, this step is particularly important in determining the accessibility of medications in Canada. And then finally, the third step is to provide all jurisdictions with formulary listing recommendations. It's important to note that some provinces, such as Ontario and British Columbia, may have their own additional expert advisory committee to review each manufacturer's request. And here it's also important to mention that while the CDR provides a recommendation on whether the drug should be listed or not in a public formulary, it's the jurisdictions themselves who determine whether they will list the drug on their formularies and under what, if any, criteria. and this is based on their policies, economic considerations, and priorities. So the following slide here represents the role that various stakeholders, such as Health Canada, industry, and regulators, play from the drug development phase all the way to drug dissemination. And the green circles that you could see in the diagram represent CTAC's involvement in informing market access. One of the things that CTAC does throughout is engage with regulators and industry to ensure that the needs of people living with HIV and hepatitis C are reflected in this process. And as you can see at the point of drug submission, which is what brings us here today, is that CTAC works to ensure that the inclusion of people living with HIV and hepatitis C is present in the patient input process. Following decisions by the Common Drug Review, we also get involved in advocating for the inclusion of new medications on public formularies. And then as we move along the circle, CTAC is also continuously involved in disseminating information, facilitating knowledge translation and exchange on treatments and treatment access. And lastly, but importantly, treatment information based on the experiences and needs of people living with HIV and hepatitis C are also disseminated and shared with industry partners in order to improve new and upcoming treatments. In Canada, there are 19 public formularies, so there is a formulary for each province as well as 6 federal drug plans. And in order to improve the health outcomes for people living with HIV, CTAC's goal is really to ensure that drugs with clinical improvement are made publicly available on all formularies. For the CDR, what are the criteria? Well, the Common Drug Review process and its recommendations for drugs on public formularies is really informed by the cost effectiveness of a drug by looking at its relation to safety and efficacy. In addition, the drug's clinical improvement is weighed against the cost of the drug. And then also a fundamental component in the Common Drug Review criteria is patient input, which again, here is one of CTAC's central roles, and it's for us to steward the patient input process for those caring for and people living with HIV and hepatitis C. Now, how does the CDR work? Well, prior to receiving a notice of compliance, drug manufacturers are able to submit their clinical trial data to the Common Drug Review. So in the case of Prezcobix, a submission was made to the CDR on May 22nd, 2014, and then a notice of compliance was issued after on June 19th, 2014. Now, if the medication treats a life-threatening or serious condition and or significantly reduces public formulary costs, the Common Drug Review can grant priority review for this medication. However, I do want to mention that at the current moment, the priority review process is being reformed by CADIS. So what are the possible recommendations that the Common Drug Review could make? Well, when the CDR provides its recommendations based on the criteria that we discussed earlier, there are 4 possible recommendations. And the first is that it could put forward to list the drug on public formularies without any restrictions. And this is really only done if it's established that a medication is determined to be safe, efficacious, and that it will significantly reduce drug plan expenditures. It's important to note here that it's very rare for the CDR to recommend for full unrestricted listing. The second recommendation, which is far more common, is for public plans to list a new medication with associated criteria. And this criteria could be clinical, cost-related, or both. And then even if a drug is determined to be efficacious and safe and offers clinical improvement, the CDR could recommend that a new medication is not to be listed at the current price. So what happens here is it requires drug manufacturers to go back and resubmit a new price, or for provinces to negotiate a lower price. And then finally, the fourth recommendation is do not list. So here it could be the case where the new medication really offers no or little therapeutic benefit over currently existing treatment. So now that I've gone over the market access piece, I just want to go into some of the clinical trial findings for Prezcobix. And to begin with a brief overview, what is Prezcobix? It's a new once-daily fixed-dose combination product, and it consists of 800 milligrams of darunavir and 150 milligrams of cobicostat. And while I'll go into further detail about each of the components separately, I wanted to mention that combining the two has been supported mainly by these three clinical trials: the ARTEMIS trial for treatment-naive patients, the ODIN trial for treatment-experienced patients, and the GS-US 216-0130 trial for both treatment-naive and experienced patients. So one of the components in Prezcobix is PREZISTA, or in its generic form, darunavir. And darunavir is the protease inhibitor for the treatment of HIV in both treatment-naive and experienced adults. And for those of you who may not be familiar with protease inhibitors, when HIV infects a CD4 cell in a person's body, what it does is it controls that cell by copying its genetic code into the cell's DNA. And then this CD4 cell is then programmed to make more and more copies of the virus by using proteins known as enzymes to produce a long viral protein chain. Now, in order to replicate, a protein-cutting enzyme known as the HIV protease must cut up these proteins into smaller pieces, which then go to assemble themselves and replicate into other cells. So what protease inhibitors do is they block the HIV protease enzyme from cutting this long viral chain, and thus preventing the cell from producing new viruses. And in the case of darunavir, it's typically been boosted with a low dose of ritonavir. Ritonavir is also a protease inhibitor, but it is most commonly used today as a booster for other protease inhibitors. And this is mainly because it increases the absorption of other protease inhibitors and stops enzymes found in the liver from breaking down these protease inhibitors. And secondly, darunavir must be taken with food and other HIV medications, usually nucleoside analogs and sometimes non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors. So in different clinical trials, darunavir has been well established to demonstrate durable efficacy, a favorable safety profile, and tolerability for both treatment-experienced and naive patients. And because of its long half-life, which is the time it takes for half of the dose to be eliminated or metabolized in the body, once daily dosing is possible. This is because the longer the half-life of the drug, the longer it takes to eliminate. The second component of Prezcobix is cobicostat, which is a boosting agent. So when compared to ritonavir, cobicostat has no antiviral activity. And the way it works is that it inhibits an enzyme called CYP3A4, and this enzyme is responsible for breaking down certain medications, including several HIV drugs. So blocking this enzyme helps boost the effectiveness of these drugs while allowing fewer pills or doses on a daily basis. And also, unlike ritonavir, cobicostat only blocks the CYP3A4 enzyme in the body, meaning that it will also likely result in fewer drug-to-drug interactions. And lastly, because of its physicochemical properties, such as its chemical stability, cobicostat is also amenable for cold formulations. We know now that darunavir requires a pharmacoenhancer to increase its availability in the body. And in a study, the bioequivalence of darunavir and cobicostat in a fixed-dose combination tablet versus both darunavir and cobicostat being administered as single agents was examined. And from the study, similar adverse events were seen when administered as fixed-dose combinations and as single agents. And in terms of adverse events, they were grade 1 or 2, which is mild to moderate, and included mostly headaches, muscle spasms, diarrhea, and nausea. There were no severe or life-threatening adverse events observed. So what this showed was that bioequivalence was demonstrated. However, a food effect was observed. So it should be noted that Prezcobix must be taken with food, and it's recommended to take it with breakfast in order to ensure optimal bioavailability. Now, what does this all mean? Why develop a fixed-dose combination? Well, there are several reasons, including dosing convenience, such as reducing pill burden, which is known to be a key driver for adherence. And with increased adherence, it's associated with reduced risk of virological failure, and increased adherence is also associated with lower levels of resistance, which ultimately leads to the preservation of other treatment options. Now over the next slide, I'm going to go over some of the study designs. I want you to bear with me. I just want everyone to understand the context in which these trials took place. So the ARTEMIS trial was a 192-week phase 3 clinical study, and it randomized 689 previously untreated people to once daily 800 milligrams of darunavir versus once daily or twice daily Kaletra, which is also a protease inhibitor. Everybody was given Truvada once daily as their backbone regimen. And the primary objective of the study was to demonstrate that once daily PREZISTA or darunavir was non-inferior to Kaletra in terms of its ability to suppress the virus to under 50 copies. Now, if PREZISTA showed to be non-inferior to Kaletra, the second objective was to test if once daily PREZISTA was superior to Kaletra. In terms of the baseline demographics and characteristics, the median age of participants was around age 33, 34. The trial was comprised of primarily males, mostly white, with a median CD4 cell count of slightly over 200. Viral loads for all participants were above 5,000, and approximately 35% of participants had viral loads exceeding 100,000 copies. What was found from the trial? Well, at week 48, it showed that once daily PREZISTA was proven to be non-inferior to once daily or twice daily Kaletra in treatment-naive patients. 84 participants taking once daily PREZISTA versus 78% of participants taking Kaletra were able to achieve viral loads of less than 50 copies or undetectable viral levels. And then at week 192, darunavir or PREZISTA continued to demonstrate that it was non-inferior to Kaletra and in fact was able to demonstrate statistical superiority. So significant differences were seen in terms of how many people with high viral loads were able to achieve undetectable levels. So in Kaletra once daily, it was at 56%, twice daily 71%, versus darunavir 79% were able to achieve undetectable levels. In terms of adverse events, grade 2 to grade 4 diarrhea, so that's moderate to severe, was significantly more for participants taking Kaletra versus darunavir or PREZISTA. And in the Kaletra group, twice daily, 8% experiences diarrhea. In once daily, 17%, versus in the PREZISTA group, only 4% of participants experienced that moderate to severe diarrhea. So what we can gather from these results is that once daily PREZISTA has demonstrated to be safe, well-tolerated, and an efficacious option for people who have never had experience with treatment before. Now, the ODIN phase 3 trial, on the other hand, was a study to compare the safety, tolerability, and efficacy of treatment-experienced adults who had no resistance-associated mutations to darunavir. And the resistance is determined by their antiretroviral history as well as resistance testing. So in this study, 590 patients with viral loads of over 1,000 copies and CD4 cell counts of greater than 50 were randomized to either 800 milligrams of darunavir once daily or 600 milligrams of darunavir twice daily. Both were given ritonavir, as well they were given 2 or more NRTIs. And here the primary objective was to assess the non-inferiority of once daily versus twice daily darunavir in terms of its ability to suppress the virus to 50 copies or below. Now, in terms of the baseline demographics and characteristics in this study, the median age of participants was 40 years of age. Males comprised 64% of study participants, leaving females comprising 36%. 88% of participants had viral levels of under 100,000 copies, leaving 12 with over 100,000 copies, and the median CD4 cell count was slightly over 200 in both groups. And as you can see, there were no restrictions on previous therapy. However, there was an exception on previous or current use of topranavir, enfuvirtide, darunavir, and current use of investigational drugs. Most participants had no primary protease inhibitor mutations, although 16% had one or more. And then roughly 32% had 0 to 2 secondary primary resistance-associated mutations, 40% had 3 to 4, and 29% had 5 or more. And I just want to differentiate between primary and secondary protease mutations. So primary mutations often have only a small, if any, effect on resistance, and then secondary mutations occur when additional mutations happen in the HIV protease enzyme during any protease inhibitor-based therapy. And so what happens is if there are significant enough changes to the HIV protease, which in other words, many mutations, there could be a high level of resistance developing depending on which protease inhibitor is used. And while not related to this study per se, I also wanted to mention that darunavir does have a high barrier to resistance. And then according to this snapshot analysis, which was at week 48, we could see that both the once daily and twice daily darunavir group were able to achieve undetectable viral levels of 69% for both groups. And what does this mean? Well, the ODIN trial was able to establish that once daily PREZISTA was non-inferior to twice daily PREZISTA in treatment-experienced patients with no resistance-associated mutations to darunavir. And in terms of side effects, the most common were moderate to severe nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, but this roughly affected only 2% of participants. And these adverse events may or may not have been possibly related to darunavir. Virologic failure was very low. Only one person developed a primary protease inhibitor mutation and darunavir-associated mutation. Lipid-related adverse events were lower in the once-daily group, so it was roughly half of that than in the twice-daily group. And what this all means is that once-daily darunavir is effective, and it could be considered an option for patients who have failed on previous treatment. Now, in terms of its safety, the overall safety profile of darunavir and cobikistat is based on the GS-US 215-0130 study and post-marketing data. Now, in the GS-US study in particular, it was a phase 3 study which evaluated the safety and efficacy of cobikistat-boosted darunavir with 2 fully active NRTIs for both treatment-experienced and naive patients. And in terms of the baseline characteristics, there's 313 participants, 295 which were treatment naive, 18 which were treatment experienced folks. 8 out of the 13 were co-infected with hepatitis C, and 5 were co-infected with hepatitis D. And the primary endpoint at up to 24 weeks was any treatment emergent severe or grade 3 or life-threatening grade 4 adverse events. And then the secondary outcome measure at week 24 and 48 was any treatment emergent adverse events and antiviral efficacy. So from the 24-week data findings in the study, 8 out of 313 participants experienced adverse events, and regardless of causality, 16 of these adverse events were severe. 2 of these were potentially life-threatening. However, it's important to note that the adverse events in general were consistent with those expected in the subject population and known safety profiles of the drug. And over the 48 weeks, the most common were diarrhea, nausea, upper respiratory tract infection, and headache. And there was no apparent relationship found between the occurrence of adverse events and exposure to darunavir. And also, no new safety events were reported with the use of darunavir and cobikistat compared to darunavir and ritonavir. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about renal safety. So in terms of renal safety, creatinine, it's a chemical waste that's produced by muscle metabolism, And generally what happens is that the kidney filters out most of the creatinine and disposes it through the urine. And typically, elevated levels of creatinine in the body are often an indicator of kidney dysfunction. So while there was a median increase in creatinine found in the body in the study, and this was due to the effects of Prezcobix, it's important to note that this doesn't increase how well the kidney is working in filtering waste or creatinine clearance, and it's not a reflection of renal health. And then finally, to mention about the efficacy and ability to suppress the virus, participants were able to achieve undetectable viral levels. So at week 24, 82% were able to achieve undetectable viral loads, and at week 48, 81% were able to do so. Now, this brings us to the end of the clinical trial findings for Prezcobix. And now some next steps of how you can get involved in the patient input process. So what CTAC's done is we've developed a user-friendly web-based survey for participants to fill out, and this is based on some of the questions that are asked in the Common Drug Review submission. So what is going to be asked of you is to answer questions based on the impact of living with or providing care services for a person living with HIV, the impact of current HIV medications from what you've observed or experienced, what adverse events are tolerable and which ones aren't, what is the impact of HIV treatment on caregivers or service providers, and lastly, for those of you who have taken Prezcobix or darunavir, how does it compare to currently available treatments? So I'm going to open the survey now, and it will be open until end of day on Monday, August 25th. And I'm just going to open the link to it right now for you. So on that note, this brings us to the end of the webinar. I want to thank you all for participating, and I just want to let everyone know that it's fundamental that your voices are heard and included in the Common Drug Review patient input submission. So please don't forget to fill out our questionnaire, as well as provide the link to others who also may be interested in getting involved in the process. Thank you.